The autumn wind swept through the courtyard of School No. 47 in the Arbat district, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and coal smoke. Inside classroom 3B, 28 children sat in rigid rows, their uniforms pressed, their necks craned toward the portrait of Stalin that dominated the wall above the blackboard. Beneath the general secretary's painted gaze, they learned arithmetic, recited verses glorifying the motherland, and absorbed the fundamental lesson of Soviet childhood. Vigilance was a virtue, and silence was survival. 9-year-old Dmitry Sokolov sat near the window, his pencil moving across a scrap of paper, while teacher Orlova droned through a lesson on collective farm production quotas. Dmitry was not a rebellious child. He was ordinary in every measurable way: average height, average grades, brown hair that his mother cut at the kitchen table every month. His father, Viktor Sokolov, worked as a mechanical engineer at Factory No. 32, a sprawling industrial complex on the city's eastern edge where they manufactured components whose purpose was never discussed at home. His mother, Anna, was a seamstress who took in piecework to supplement Viktor's modest salary. They lived in a communal apartment on Furskaya Street, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with 3 other families, their single room partitioned by a curtain that gave the illusion of privacy. Dmitry's drawing was not meant to be art. It was simply what he had seen 3 days earlier, walking home from school with his mother. They had turned onto Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street when Anna suddenly gripped his hand tighter, her pace quickening. Dmitry looked up to see what had startled her. Ahead, near the corner where the bread shop stood, 2 men in dark overcoats flanked a third man older, wearing glasses, his face pale and confused. One of the overcoats held the man's arm firmly. The other scanned the street with the mechanical precision of a surveillance camera. A black Pobeda sedan idled at the curb, its engine rumbling, exhaust clouding in the cold air. "Don't look," Anna had whispered, pulling Dmitry past. But children always look when told not to. Dmitry saw the man's frightened eyes. He saw one of the overcoats open the sedan's rear door. He saw the man stumble as he was pushed inside, his glasses falling onto the pavement where they were crushed under a polished boot. The car door slammed. The Pobeda pulled away. The street returned to its rhythm as if nothing had happened. Women queuing for bread, a tram rattling past, pigeons pecking at spilled grain. At home that evening, Dmitry asked his father what he had witnessed. Viktor had been reading Pravda at the small table they used for meals. He lowered the newspaper slowly, exchanged a glance with Anna, then spoke in the careful tone adults used when lying to protect children. "You saw men doing their duty, Dmitry. The security organs protect us from enemies of the people. That man must have done something wrong. But he looked scared, Papa, like he didn't want to go." Viktor folded the newspaper with deliberate precision. Sometimes people don't understand they've made mistakes until it's explained to them. This is how the state keeps us safe. He reached across the table and ruffled Dmitry's hair. "You're a smart boy. You understand that loyalty to the motherland means trusting our leaders, yes?" Dmitry nodded, though he didn't fully understand. That night, lying on his cot behind the curtain, he heard his parents whispering. His father's voice was strained. "We say nothing. We know nothing. We saw nothing." His mother's reply was too soft to hear, but Dmitry caught the fear in its cadence. 3 days later, during teacher Orlova's tedious lecture, Dmitry's mind wandered back to that moment. He began to sketch it not as an act of defiance or political commentary, but as the idle recreation of a memory. He drew the street corner with its bread shop sign. He drew the 3 figures, the frightened man in the middle, the 2 broad-shouldered men on either side. He drew the Pobeda sedan, its boxy shape instantly recognizable to anyone who lived in Moscow. He even drew the glasses on the pavement, a small detail that had stuck in his memory because his own father wore similar frames. He was shading the car's windows when teacher Orlova's shadow fell across his desk. Dmitry Sokolov, she said, her voice cutting through the classroom murmur. What is that you're working on instead of listening to your lesson? The room fell silent. 28 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Dmitry felt his face flush. Nothing, Teacher Orlova. Just a drawing. Let me see it. He hesitated, sensing danger in a way children do instinctively without understanding why. But disobedience was unthinkable. He handed her the paper. Teacher Orlova studied it for a long moment, her expression unreadable behind her wire-rimmed spectacles. She was 43 years old, a lifelong party member who had taught through the war years when half her students' fathers never came home. She had survived the purges of the 1930s by developing an acute sensitivity to political danger, a radar for ideological contamination. What she saw in Dmitry's drawing made that radar scream. Where did you see this? She asked quietly. On Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street, near the bread shop. When? 3 days ago. I was walking with Mama. Teacher Orlova folded the paper carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Return to your arithmetic, Dmitry. Her voice was steady, but something had changed in the air, a shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded a storm. After school, Teacher Orlova did not go home. She walked 4 blocks to a gray building with no sign, its windows covered by heavy curtains. She climbed to the second floor and knocked on a door marked only with a room number. Inside, she met with Captain Grigory Volkov of the Ministry of State Security, the MGB, soon to be reorganized as the KGB. Volkov was 36, a veteran of wartime counterintelligence operations against German spies, now tasked with rooting out domestic enemies during the height of Stalin's final paranoid years. This was drawn by a 9-year-old boy, Orlova explained, sliding the paper across Volkov's desk. He claims he witnessed an arrest on Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street. Volkov examined the drawing with the teal intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. His eyes moved from the frightened man to the security agents to the Pobeda sedan. Did he identify any of these individuals? No, Comrade Captain. But the detail is ... concerning. The car, the positioning of the agents, the location. He's recorded an operational moment. Volkov leaned back in his chair. Through the window behind him, Moscow's skyline bristled with construction cranes, Stalin's 7 Sisters, the Gothic skyscrapers meant to showcase Soviet superiority, rising like monuments to paranoia. Children draw what they see. The question is, why did he see it? Why was he in that location at that precise time? Coincidence, perhaps? There are no coincidences in our work, Teacher Orlova. Only patterns waiting to be recognized. He opened a leather-bound notebook and wrote down Dmitry's name, his address, his parents' names, and workplaces. You did the right thing bringing this to us. Vigilance protects the motherland. I'll need to speak with the boy and his family. That evening, Viktor Sokolov came home from Factory No. 32 carrying a newspaper and a small bag of potatoes he'd waited 2 hours to purchase. Anna was mending a jacket by the window's fading light. Dmitry was practicing his penmanship at the table. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary Soviet home tea brewing on the hot plate. The neighbor's radio playing martial music through the thin walls, the smell of cabbage soup from the communal kitchen. Victor hung his coat on the hook behind the door and kissed his wife's forehead. How was school, Dmitry? Good, Papa. What did you learn today? Dmitry hesitated, remembering Teacher Orlova's strange reaction to his drawing. We studied production quotas, and I drew a picture. What kind of picture? Before Dmitry could answer, there was a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Victor and Anna froze. In the Soviet Union, unexpected knocks after dark carried weight. Victor opened the door to find 2 men in dark overcoats. Behind them stood Captain Volkov, his identification card held up like a talisman. Viktor Mikhailovich Sokolov? Yes. I am Captain Volkov, Ministry of State Security. I need to ask you and your family some questions about an incident your son witnessed. May we come in?" It was not really a question. Victor stepped aside. The three men entered, filling the small room with the smell of cigarettes and authority. Dmitri watched from the table, his pencil still in his hand, suddenly understanding that his innocent, thoughtless drawing had done something terrible. The Lubyanka sat at the heart of Moscow like a malignant tumor, its yellow brick facade and symmetrical windows projecting bureaucratic orderliness while concealing the machinery of terror within. Muscovites avoided looking at it directly when they passed through Lubyanka Square, as if eye contact with the building itself might draw unwanted attention. In the basement, corridors stretched beneath the city streets, connecting interrogation rooms where the architecture of confession had been refined to a science. Viktor Sokolov walked those corridors now, flanked by guards, his wrists bound, his mind racing through the calculus of survival. 3 days had passed since Captain Volkov entered his home. The interrogations had begun immediately, first in the communal apartment with Anna and Dmitri present, then separately at the MGB district office, and finally here, in the building from which few emerged unchanged. Victor had been arrested formally on the second day and charged under Article 58 of the Criminal Code counter-revolutionary activity, espionage, sabotage. The charges were vague by design, elastic enough to encompass almost anything, specific enough to sound legitimate in a courtroom. The interrogation room was small and windowless, painted institutional green. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. A metal table dominated the space, with 2 chairs on one side and one on the other. Victor was directed to the solitary chair. Across from him sat Captain Volkov and another man older, heavyset, with the resigned patience of someone who had conducted thousands of these sessions. He introduced himself as Major Karpov, Volkov's superior. "Viktor Mikhailovich," Major Karpov began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "we want to understand what happened. We're not your enemies. We're trying to protect the motherland from those who would harm her. You work at Factory No. 32, correct?" "Yes, Comrade Major." "As a mechanical engineer? Classified work? Components for industrial machinery?" "I don't know the final applications." "That's the appropriate answer for someone in your position," Karpov acknowledged. "Need-to-know basis. Information compartmentalization. These are security protocols. You understand their importance?" "Yes, Comrade Major." "Good. So you understand that any breach of these protocols, intentional or accidental, represents a serious threat to state security." Victor's throat tightened. "I have never breached any protocols. I'm loyal to the Soviet Union. I fought in the war. I served in the Red Army from 1941 to 1945, from Stalingrad to Berlin. I have medals." "We know your service record," Captain Volkov interrupted, opening a thick file that sat on the table between them, decorated twice. "Wounded at Kursk. Commendable. But war service doesn't immunize anyone from ideological corruption. History is full of heroes who later became traitors. The war ended 7 years ago. Much has changed." Major Karpov raised a hand, silencing Volkov's aggression with a gesture. "Let's focus on the specific incident. Your son Dmitri witnessed an arrest on Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street on October 14th. He then drew a detailed picture of that arrest at school. The question we need answered is, how did a 9-year-old boy come to be in that exact location at that exact moment to witness a classified security operation?" Victor felt the trap closing. "We were walking home from school. It was pure coincidence. We live nearby. We walk that route 3 or 4 times a week. Coincidence," Volkov repeated, making the word sound like an accusation. "Your route takes you past that corner regularly?" "Yes. So you're familiar with the neighborhood." You know, the shops, the residents, the patterns of daily life? Yes, like anyone who lives in an area. And the man who was arrested, did you recognize him? Victor had known this question was coming. He had lain awake in his cell the previous 2 nights, rehearsing answers, trying to find the safe path through the minefield. The truth was dangerous, but lies, if discovered, were fatal. I didn't see his face clearly. We were walking past quickly. My wife pulled me along. I assumed it was security business. I didn't pry, but your son saw enough to draw a picture. Children notice details adults miss. He's observant. It doesn't mean anything. Major Karpov leaned forward. Viktor Mikhailovich, let me be direct with you. The man arrested that day was Yevgeny Fedorovich Bronstein, a technician at the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, our nuclear program. He was arrested on suspicion of passing classified information to foreign intelligence services. This is one of the most serious investigations currently active in Moscow. And your son produced a drawing that accurately depicts operational security procedures, vehicle positioning, and surveillance methodology. Do you understand how that looks? The room seemed to contract. Victor struggled to breathe normally. I had no idea who that man was. I didn't know anything about nuclear programs or spies. I'm a mechanical engineer. I assemble components. I come home to my family. That's my entire life. Yet somehow your son was perfectly positioned to document this arrest. It was chance. Bad luck. Nothing more. Volkov stood abruptly, his chair scraping against concrete. He circled behind Victor, a predator establishing dominance. Here's what I think happened, Viktor Mikhailovich. I think you were conducting surveillance. I think you were assigned to monitor Bronstein by whoever you're working for, probably the Americans, maybe the British. I think you brought your son along as cover, using a child as camouflage for your spying. When the boy innocently drew what you'd positioned him to witness, he accidentally exposed your operation. A child's honesty undermined your deception. No, Victor said, his voice cracking. No, that's insane. I'm not a spy. I've never betrayed my country. I would never use my son. Then explain the drawing, Volkov snapped. Explain why a 9-year-old boy produced operational intelligence documentation. Explain the perfect sight lines, the detailed vehicle description, the positioning of security personnel. Explain it in a way that doesn't point to premeditation and training. Victor's mind raced. How could he explain an innocent coincidence to men whose job was to see conspiracy in everything? How could he prove a negative? My son likes to draw. He draws everything he sees: buildings, people, cars, animals. This was no different. He wasn't trained. He wasn't positioned. He's a child who drew a picture. That's all. Major Karpov reopened the file, withdrawing several documents. Do you know a man named Ilya Reznik? The name meant nothing. No. Anatoly Messing? No. David Stein? No. Comrade Major. I don't know any of these people. They all engineers or technicians who've been arrested in the past 6 months for suspected espionage. All of them worked in sensitive positions. All of them claimed innocence initially. All of them eventually confessed. The evidence against them was overwhelming coded messages, unexplained contacts with foreigners, gaps in their movements that couldn't be accounted for. We're very good at establishing patterns, Viktor Mikhailovich. And right now, you're fitting into a pattern we've seen before. Victor felt reality fracturing. He was trapped in a nightmare logic where innocence could be structured to look like guilt, where random chance could be reinterpreted as conspiracy. I'm telling you the truth. I have nothing to confess because I've done nothing wrong. Volkov returned to his seat, leaning across the table until his face was inches from Victor's. Everyone says that at first. Pride makes men stupid. But eventually, the truth emerges. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. The state has time. The state has methods. The state always wins. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Think about your family, Viktor Mikhailovich. Think about your wife and son. Cooperation can reduce sentences. Stubbornness only makes things harder for everyone. The implicit threat against Anna and Dmitri struck Viktor like a physical blow. In that moment, he understood fully what he was facing. This wasn't an investigation seeking truth. It was a machinery that needed to be fed, that had already decided his guilt and was now simply extracting the confession that would justify predetermined conclusions. His innocence was irrelevant. The drawing, that cursed innocent drawing, had marked him. Major Karpov stood, gathering the file. We'll continue this conversation tomorrow. Tonight, think carefully about what you want to tell us. Think about whether protecting secrets that don't belong to you is worth destroying your family's future. Sleep on it, Viktor Mikhailovich. We'll talk again when you're ready to be honest. The guards returned Viktor to his cell, a narrow concrete box with a metal bunk, a bucket, and a small barred window near the ceiling through which he could see a rectangle of gray Moscow sky. He sat on the bunk, head in his hands, trying to process what had just happened. How had a simple walk home from school become espionage? How had his son's drawing become evidence of treason? The logical part of his mind understood that this was how the system worked, how it had always worked, especially in these paranoid final years of Stalin's rule. Quotas needed to be filled. Enemies needed to be discovered. And once the machinery locked onto a target, escape was nearly impossible. Through the walls he could hear muffled sounds of other prisoners, other interrogations, the ambient suffering of the Lubyanka's depths. Viktor thought of Dmitri, who would blame himself even though he bore no blame. He thought of Anna, who would now face suspicion by association, her life disrupted, her reputation stained. He thought of the modest life they de-built in their single room in the communal apartment, the small joys, the quiet dignity, the hope that had sustained them through war and deprivation. All of it now under threat because a child had drawn a picture. Viktor Sokolov closed his eyes and prayed to a God the state said didn't exist, asking for a miracle he knew wouldn't come. Winter arrived early that year, spreading its gray shroud across Moscow with the inevitability of state policy. By early November, snow accumulated in the courtyards, frost painted patterns on apartment windows, and the cold seeped through walls and clothing, settling into bones. For Anna Sokolov, the weather mirrored the freeze that had descended on her life since Viktor's arrest. She had been summoned to the MGB office twice for questioning polite in tone but terrifying in implication. They wanted to know about Viktor's friends, his routines, his conversations, his political views. They wanted her to remember details from years ago, to reinterpret innocent moments through the lens of suspicion. Was it true he'd complained about food shortages? Had he ever criticized factory management? Did he listen to foreign radio broadcasts? Anna had answered carefully, truthfully, desperately. No, Viktor was loyal. No, he never expressed anti-Soviet sentiments. No, they own no radio capable of receiving foreign transmissions. But her interrogators seemed disappointed by these answers, as if they were looking for confirmation of a narrative already written, and her refusal to provide it was itself suspicious. She left each session feeling hollowed out, aware that her family had crossed an invisible threshold from which there might be no return. Dmitri had stopped drawing entirely. At school, he sat silent and withdrawn, completing assignments mechanically while avoiding eye contact with teacher Olova, who treated him now with a cold formality that frightened him more than anger would have. The other children had learned to keep their distance, not through explicit instruction, but through the osmotic understanding of Soviet childhood that contamination was social. If Dmitri's family was under investigation, proximity to him was dangerous. Even his closest friend Pavel now sat on the opposite side of the classroom and looked away when they passed in the hallway. At home, Anna tried to maintain normalcy. She prepared meals, mended clothing, spoke with forced cheerfulness about Victor's eventual return. But Dmitri saw the fear in her eyes, heard her crying behind the curtain at night, noticed how she startled at every knock on the door and avoided conversations with the other families in their communal apartment. He understood, with the terrible clarity that trauma brings to children, that his drawing had destroyed everything. He had betrayed his father without meaning to, exposed him to danger through innocent observation. One evening, as Anna prepared a thin cabbage soup for dinner, Dmitri finally spoke the question that had been suffocating him. "Mama, will Papa come home?" Anna's hands stopped moving. She stood at the small stove, back to her son, and Dmitri saw her shoulders tighten. When she turned, her face was composed but pale. "Yes, Dmitri, Papa will come home. He's done nothing wrong. The state will realize this. We just have to be patient. But the drawing was just a drawing. You did nothing wrong either. Remember that." She crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his hands. "Listen to me carefully. What happened was not your fault. Papa would never blame you. I don't blame you. You're a child who drew a picture, that's all. Then why did they take him?" Anna struggled for an answer that would comfort without lying too obviously. Sometimes there are misunderstandings. The security organs have to investigate everything to keep us safe. Once they finish investigating, they'll see Papa is innocent and release him. Dmitri wanted to believe her. But he had learned something in the past weeks that most children don't discover until adulthood. That parents can't always protect you, that the world is more frightening than the stories suggest, and that innocence is no defense against the machinery of power. He nodded anyway, accepting the comfort of her words even though they both knew they might not be true. At Lubyanka, Victor's interrogations had intensified. Major Karpov had been replaced by a team of younger, more aggressive officers who worked in shifts, ensuring Victor never had more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep before the next session began. They used techniques refined over decades: psychological pressure, physical exhaustion, logical traps, and the constant implication that confession was inevitable and resistance futile. They showed him fabricated evidence, documents supposedly linking him to foreign agents, testimony from coworkers claiming he'd expressed anti-Soviet views, technical drawings allegedly passed to Western intelligence services. "Just sign the confession," Senior Lieutenant Petrov urged during one session, sliding paper across the table. "Admit that you were recruited by American intelligence, that you were tasked with monitoring Soviet security operations, that you used your son as cover. Sign it, and this ends. You'll be sentenced to labor camp, yes, but you'll live. Your family will be spared further investigation. Your son can continue his education. Refuse, and this continues until we extract what we need through other methods. And your family will suffer the consequences of your association." Victor stared at the confession, his vision blurred from exhaustion. The text swam before his eyes, a fantasy of betrayal he'd never committed, rendered in bureaucratic language, ready for his signature. He knew what signing would mean: years in the Gulag, possibly death, and the permanent stain of being labeled a traitor. But he also knew what refusing might mean for Anna and Dmitri. In Stalin's Soviet Union, families of convicted spies were often punished, collectively exiled, imprisoned, or simply erased from society. The choice they were offering wasn't between truth and lies. It was between his destruction alone or his family's destruction with him. "I can't sign something that isn't true," Victor whispered. Petrov sighed with theatrical disappointment. "Truth is what serves the interests of the Soviet state, Viktor Mikhailovich. Your personal interpretation of events is irrelevant. We have evidence. We have witness statements. We have the drawing your son made physical proof of surveillance activity. Whether you sign or not, the conclusion is the same. The only variable is how much suffering you cause yourself and your family by delaying the inevitable." Another interrogator, a woman named Captain Lebedeva, entered with a new file. She was in her 30s, coldly professional, and specialized in breaking prisoners through psychological rather than physical means. She sat down beside Petrov and opened the file with deliberate slowness. "Viktor Mikhailovich, I want to show you something." She withdrew a photograph and placed it on the table. It showed Anna and Dmitri leaving their apartment building, captured from across the street with a telephoto lens. "This was taken yesterday. Your family is under constant surveillance now. Everything they do, everyone they speak to, everywhere they go, we're watching. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Victor's heart hammered against his ribs. The photograph was a threat so clear it didn't need to be stated explicitly. Your family is vulnerable. Your family is in our hands. Cooperate or they suffer. He looked at Dmitri's face in the photograph, small, frightened, shoulders hunched against the cold, and felt something break inside him. "If I sign," he said slowly, "will you leave them alone? Will you guarantee Anna and Dmitri won't be punished?" Captain Lebedeva exchanged a glance with Petrov. "Sign a full confession, provide details about your handlers and methods, and we have no reason to pursue your family further." They were unwitting participants. The state has no interest in punishing the innocent. Victor almost laughed at that final lie. The state's relationship with innocence was complicated at best. But he was out of options, out of strength, out of hope. He reached for the pen Petrov offered. His hand shook as he touched the paper. For a moment, he hesitated, some final stubborn part of him rebelling against signing away his dignity, his truth, his life. Then he thought of Dmitri, alone in school, friendless and frightened. He thought of Anna, trying to hold their world together with nothing but determination and love. He thought of the photograph, the surveillance, the implicit threat. Viktor Sokolov signed the confession. The document stated that he had been recruited by American intelligence in 1950 through a contact at Factory No. 32 whose name he'd been instructed never to learn. That he'd been tasked with conducting surveillance on Soviet security operations. That he'd used his son as cover during these surveillance activities. That he'd intended to pass information about factory production to his handlers. That he deeply regretted his betrayal of the motherland and accepted whatever punishment the Soviet state deemed appropriate. Every word was a lie. Every word would now become official truth, recorded in state archives, used to justify his conviction, and serve as evidence for future propaganda about Western espionage threats. Victor signed his name at the bottom and pushed the paper away, feeling the last remnants of hope drain from his body. "Good," Captain Lebedeva said, collecting the confession with satisfaction. "You've made the right choice. Your trial will be expedited. Sentencing should occur within 2 weeks. Your family will be informed." Victor was returned to his cell. He lay on the metal bunk staring at the ceiling, trying to process what he'd just done. He had confessed to crimes he didn't commit to protect his family from punishment for his non-existent treason. The logic was circular, absurd, and completely consistent with the system that had produced it. He wondered if Bronstein, the man whose arrest Dmitri had witnessed, had also signed a similar confession. He wondered how many other men in this building, in other prisons across the Soviet Union, had done the same thing, sacrificed their truth to save their families, only to discover that the machinery of the state was indifferent to such sacrifices. Days blurred together. Victor was allowed no visitors, no communication with Anna or Dmitri. His trial, when it came, was conducted in a closed military tribunal that lasted less than 2 hours. The confession was entered as primary evidence. The drawing was presented as corroboration physical proof of operational surveillance. No witnesses testified on Victor's behalf because none were allowed. His appointed defense counsel made no substantive arguments, offering only a pro forma suggestion that the court show mercy given Victor's war service record. The three judges deliberated for 12 minutes before returning with a verdict: guilty on all charges under Article 58. The sentence: death by firing squad, to be carried out within 10 days. Victor heard the sentence without emotion. Some threshold had been crossed where fear and despair gave way to numbness. He was returned to a different cell block, smaller, darker, reserved for those awaiting execution. Through the narrow window, he could see snow falling on Moscow, covering the city in false purity. He thought about his son, who would grow up knowing his father died labeled a traitor. He thought about the drawing, that innocent sketch, now preserved in MGB archives as evidence of espionage. He thought about the absurd, tragic randomness of it all, how a routine walk home from school had triggered this cascade of consequences. On the 8th day after his sentencing, 2 guards came for him at dawn. They led him down stone corridors to a small courtyard where frost glittered on cobblestones. Victor saw the wall, saw the drain in the center of the courtyard where blood was washed away, saw the officer checking his pistol. He thought of Anna. He thought of Dmitri. He thought of the life they might have had. The last thing Viktor Sokolov saw was snow falling through gray light, silent and indifferent, covering everything. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, 4 months after Viktor Sokolov's execution. The announcement came through loudspeakers in factories and schools, through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines, sending shockwaves of grief and uncertainty through the Soviet Union. Citizens wept in the streets, genuinely mourning or performing mourning as self-protection. It was often impossible to distinguish between the two. The cult of personality that Stalin had cultivated ensured that his death felt like the end of the world to millions who couldn't imagine the Soviet Union without him. But for others, quietly and carefully, it represented the first stirring of hope that the terror might ease. Anna Sokolov heard the announcement while at work in the garment factory where she'd taken a position after Victor S. arrest. She felt nothing, no grief, no relief, just the empty hollowness that had become her constant companion. Victor had been executed in November. She had received notification 3 days after his death, delivered by a courier who handed her an envelope and left without words. The document inside was brief and bureaucratic. Sentence carried out. Personal effects will be returned within 30 days. Burial location classified. There had been no grave to visit, no body to mourn properly, no closure beyond the cold finality of official notification. Dmitri, now 10 years old, had withdrawn so deeply into himself that Anna feared he might never fully emerge. He attended school mechanically, spoke only when directly addressed, and spent his free time staring out their apartment window at the Moscow streets below. He never drew anymore. Anna had disposed of all his art supplies, unable to look at pencils or paper without remembering. She tried to reach her son through small gestures, extra portions of food when available, gentle conversations about his day, reassurances that his father's death wasn't his fault. But Dmitri remained trapped in his guilt, convinced that his innocent drawing had murdered his father. The years that followed Stalin's death brought subtle changes. Under Khrushchev's leadership, the worst excesses of the terror began to ease. The Gulag system was gradually reduced. Thousands of political prisoners were released and rehabilitated, their convictions quietly overturned as the state acknowledged previous excesses without accepting full responsibility. In 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech to the Party Congress officially denounced Stalin's cult of personality and some of his crimes, though many details remained classified and many victims remained forgotten. Anna applied for Victor's rehabilitation in 1957, submitting forms and petitions to the bureaucratic maze that had consumed her husband. The process was slow and frustrating, requiring documentation of innocence from a man who had confessed under duress, requiring proof that the state had been wrong without directly accusing the state of wrongdoing. It took 3 years for a response to arrive, a brief letter stating that Viktor Sokolov guest case had been reviewed and his conviction overturned posthumously due to lack of evidence of actual criminal activity. The letter contained no apology, no compensation, no acknowledgement of the injustice or the human cost. Viktor was simply erased from the roster of enemies and returned to the category of ordinary Soviet citizens who had never existed as anything other than statistics. Dmitry was 13 when he learned his father had been officially declared innocent. Anna showed him the rehabilitation letter, hoping it might ease the burden of guilt he carried. Instead, it seemed to deepen his despair. "They killed him for nothing," he said quietly, staring at the official document. "They murdered him knowing he was innocent. And this letter changes nothing. Papa is still dead." Anna had no response that could repair such damage. She held her son while he cried for the first time since Viktor Asarest, years of suppressed grief finally breaking through in wrenching sobs that shook his thin frame. They cried together in their small room in the communal apartment, two survivors of a system that had chewed up their family and spit out bureaucratic acknowledgement as compensation. Dmitry grew up haunted. He completed his education, became a skilled machinist like his father, married a quiet woman named Katya who never asked about his past. They had a daughter, Marina, born in 1972, and Dmitry tried to build a normal life despite the weight he carried. But he never spoke about what happened in 1952. He never told Katya about the drawing, about being the instrument of his father's destruction. He never told Marina why her grandfather's photograph sat in a drawer rather than displayed, why certain questions about family history were met with silence. The trauma became a sealed box inside him, corroding slowly. The Soviet Union lurched through the decades' Brezhnev stagnation, the brief flickers of reform under Andropov and Chernenko, the rise of Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost and perestroika. As the 1980s progressed, the state that had seemed eternal began to crack. Archives opened, revealing horrors previously whispered but now documented. Families learned the fates of relatives who had disappeared decades earlier. The systematic nature of the terror became undeniable, even to those who had preferred comfortable ignorance. In December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The red flag came down from the Kremlin. The system that had executed Viktor Sokolov ceased to exist. Dmitry Sokolov, now 48 years old, watched the news broadcasts with complex emotion satisfaction at seeing the system collapse, bitterness that it had taken so long to spare that his father hadn't lived to see it, guilt that he was still carrying after nearly 40 years. That winter, Dmitry finally told his daughter the truth. Marina was 19, studying history at Moscow State University, part of a generation trying to understand the world their grandparents had endured. They sat in Dmitry's small apartment. He and Katya had their own place now, no longer sharing communal space, and he retrieved a box he'd kept hidden for decades. Inside was the rehabilitation letter from 1960. Beneath it, wrapped in yellowed paper, was the original notification of Viktor's execution. And beneath that, carefully preserved, was a copy of the drawing, the sketch that had started everything. "I need to show you something," Dmitry said. "I need to tell you why I've been the way I am. Why I couldn't talk about your grandfather. Why I've carried this weight my entire life." He told her the story, all of it, from the walk home from school, to the drawing in class, to Teacher Orlova's report, to the interrogations, the trial, the execution. Marina listened with growing horror, tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she looked at the drawing, faded now, the pencil lines soft with age, and tried to comprehend how something so innocent had generated such destruction. "Papa," she whispered, "it wasn't your fault. You were a child. You were 9 years old. You drew what you saw. That's all. I know that intellectually," Dmitry replied. "I've known it for years, but knowing and feeling are different things. I was the instrument. My hand made the marks. My observation gave them evidence. Without me, Papa might have lived. Without the system, Papa would have lived," Marina corrected firmly. "Without paranoia and quotas and arbitrary power, your drawing would have been meaningless. The fault lies with them, with teacher Orlova, who reported an innocent child, with the MGB officers who constructed conspiracy from coincidence, with the judges who pronounced sentence, with the executioners who pulled triggers. Not with you. Never with you." Dmitri looked at his daughter, smart, brave, part of a generation that demanded accountability from history, and felt something shift inside him. Not healing, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of healing. The permission to assign blame where it belonged rather than carrying it himself. The understanding that he had been a victim too, that his childhood had been destroyed alongside his father's life. Over the following months, Marina researched the case as part of her university studies. She accessed newly opened archives, read through MGB files that detailed the investigation. She found Victor's confession and recognized immediately the signs of coercion, the formulaic language, the implausible details, the confession of crimes that made no strategic sense. She found records of other cases from the same period, saw the patterns: arrest quotas, fabricated evidence, forced confessions, and executions carried out to fill statistical requirements rather than punish actual crimes. She also found teacher Orlova's original report, written in careful longhand and filed with Dmitri's drawing attached. The document was chilling in its banality, a teacher doing her duty as she understood it, reporting a potential security concern without apparent malice, but also without compassion or critical thought. Marina wondered what had become of Orlova, whether she had lived to see the system she served collapse, whether she had ever felt remorse for setting this tragedy in motion. Marina compiled her research into her senior thesis, Children as Instruments of State Terror, Case Studies from the Late Stalin Period. Victor and Dmitri's story formed the emotional core of the work, but she contextualized it within the broader patterns of Soviet paranoia, ways the state weaponized innocents turned families against themselves and created a surveillance culture where even children couldn't be trusted to simply be children. Her professors praised the work for its clarity and emotional power. She graduated with honors. In 1995, Marina published an expanded version of her thesis as a book. It received significant attention in post-Soviet Russia, where society was still grappling with the legacy of totalitarianism. Interviews with Dmitri appeared in newspapers and on television. He told Victor's story publicly for the first time, describing his father as an ordinary man destroyed by extraordinary cruelty, a loyal Soviet citizen murdered by the system he had served faithfully. Public reaction was mixed. Some praised Dmitri for his courage in speaking out, seeing his story as emblematic of countless similar tragedies. Others accused him of attacking Russia's past, of participating in Western propaganda designed to humiliate the nation. The debate reflected the conflicted relationship post-Soviet Russia had with its history, simultaneously acknowledging the terror while resisting full accountability, wanting to honor victims while avoiding the implications of systemic guilt. For Dmitri personally, the publicity was difficult but ultimately therapeutic. Speaking openly about what had happened, hearing from other families who had endured similar tragedies, and seeing Victor's story preserved in his daughter's scholarship gave him something he'd never had before: context. He wasn't alone. His family suffering wasn't unique. What had felt like a personal burden was actually a tiny thread in an enormous tapestry of injustice. In 1998, Marina organized a memorial ceremony at one of Moscow's cemeteries where victims of political repression were honored. Hundreds attended, representing thousands of families who had lost members to the terror. Victor's name was added to a memorial wall alongside tens of thousands of others. Dmitri stood before that wall, his daughter beside him, his wife's hand in his, and finally allowed himself to say goodbye properly. 46 years after Victor's execution, his son was able to mourn publicly, to declare his father's innocence before witnesses, to reclaim his memory from the archives that had tried to bury it. Dmitry Sokolov died in 2003 at age 60, finally released from the weight he'd carried. At his funeral, Marina placed 2 items in his coffin: a photograph of Victor in his Red Army uniform, and a copy of the drawing, the artifact that had destroyed one life and scarred another, but which had ultimately become evidence not of treason, but of the terrible human cost of political paranoia. The drawing had been intended as nothing more than a child's sketch. It had been twisted into proof of espionage. And finally, decades later, it had been reclaimed as testimony to innocence and injustice. Marina continued her work as a historian, specializing in the documentation of Stalin-era repression. She helped establish oral history projects recording survivors' testimonies before that generation passed away entirely. She worked with memorial societies dedicated to preserving the names and stories of terror victims. Viktor Sokolov's story appeared in her subsequent books and articles, always carefully researched, always respectful of the human beings behind the historical statistics. Today, Victor's case file sits in the Russian State Archive in Moscow, accessible to researchers. The drawing remains attached to the original investigative documents, a small sketch in faded pencil showing 3 men and a car on a Moscow street corner. To a casual observer, it's unremarkable. To those who know the story, it's a monument to the dangers of unchecked state power, to the vulnerability of ordinary people caught in political machinery, and to the ways innocence can be weaponized against the innocent. The Cold War has ended. The Soviet Union has dissolved. Stalin has been dead for 70 years. But the lessons embedded in Viktor and Dmitry Sokolov's story remain relevant. That systems built on paranoia inevitably consume their own citizens, that loyalty provides no protection from arbitrary power, that children should never be forced to navigate adult politics, and that sometimes a single moment, a simple walk home from school, a drawing made during a boring lesson, can trigger consequences that echo through generations. In a Moscow classroom today, children still draw. They sketch their neighborhoods, their families, the things they see on their way to school. Their teachers encourage their creativity without fear. Their parents don't worry that innocent observation will be interpreted as evidence of treason. This freedom, the freedom to draw without terror, to observe without consequence, is Viktor Sokolov's posthumous victory. He died so that someday children could simply be children again. His story endures not as a call for revenge or bitterness, but as a reminder of what must never be repeated and what must always be remembered.